Ungrateful son humiliates his father at his medical graduation. But when the father takes the microphone to speak, everyone is stunned. The house was small, with exposed brick walls and aging furniture, but it was meticulously clean. The cement floor was swept, and on the wooden table sat a piece of bread and a cup of lukewarm coffee. The only remnants of a breakfast Antonio had barely touched, overcome with nerves on this big day. The light coming through the window showed just how anxious he was. His calloused hands trembled as he tried to straighten the wrinkled collar of an old suit, one he kept tucked away in his closet for years, waiting for a special occasion like this. Antonio looked into the small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. Wearing that faded suit, he looked like a shadow of his younger self. His face was weathered by sun and hard labor, his thinning gray hair a testament to countless early mornings spent in the fields, whole days bent over the soil, digging, planting, harvesting, all to see his son smile and support his dream of studying medicine. Next to the mirror was a makeshift shelf where he kept his most precious items. Gently, he reached out and picked up a simple wooden frame. The photo inside was faded, but Antonio didn't need colors to remember the spark in Caio's eyes, back when he was just a boy with messy hair and a shy smile. In the photo, young Caio was holding a notebook with worn, scribbled pages, the first one his father had ever bought him. Antonio remembered that day well. He'd worked 3 extra days in the fields to be able to give his son that gift. Each page of that notebook had been a small sacrifice he was more than happy to make. He smiled at the photo, a smile filled with pride and longing. He pressed the frame to his chest and murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "Today is the big day, my son. Everything I did for you." Hearing his own voice, he felt tears welling up and quickly brushed them away, trying to shake off the emotion. He needed to be strong. He didn't want Caio to see him looking so tired and emotional. He wanted his son to be proud of him, just as he had always been proud of his son. After making sure his suit looked as presentable as possible, Antonio took a deep breath and gave one last glance around the house before heading out. He couldn't help but think about how this simple place, full of memories, had witnessed so many sacrifices, countless sleepless nights, and endless days of hard work. It was there that he dreamed and planned his son's future, often without knowing how he would pay the next semester's tuition, yet somehow always finding a way, no matter the cost. As he stepped outside, he felt the warmth of the morning sun on his face and took a deep breath. In his pockets, he had just enough money for the bus fare to the city and maybe a snack. But that didn't matter. He was on his way to Caio's graduation, the boy he had once cradled in his arms, and who was now graduating as a doctor. To Antonio, this meant more than anything else in the world. As he walked toward the bus stop, taking slow and careful steps, he whispered to himself, as if trying to convince his own heart, "Today is my son's day, and nothing is going to ruin it. I just want to be there by his side, see him smile, and maybe he'll feel proud of his father, too." Even though he didn't know what awaited him, Antonio held tightly onto that desire in his heart, like a flame that refused to go out. It was the pride of a father who, despite everything, would never stop believing in the love he had for his son. The auditorium was a grand, imposing place, with marble columns and a massive crystal chandelier sparkling on the high ceiling, casting glittering lights over the crowd. People moved about in formal attire, elegant dresses, and well-tailored suits, chatting among themselves about the promising futures of the medical graduates. Antonio entered timidly, feeling insecure, his eyes taking in every detail with a mix of admiration and discomfort. He had never been in a place like this, and his old suit seemed even more out of place in such a luxurious setting. Still, nothing could wipe the smile off his face. He was eager to see Caio and hug him, like he used to do when his son would come home on breaks, younger and full of stories about life in the big city. Antonio moved closer to the group of graduates and spotted his son, who was surrounded by friends and professors, all laughing and congratulating him, proud of his achievement. "Caio," called Antonio, lifting his hand in a joyful wave, trying to contain the emotion that made his voice shake. He walked toward his son, his chest swelling with pride, arms outstretched, already imagining the embrace. Caio turned at the sound of his father's voice, and a look of immediate embarrassment crossed his face. His eyes swept over the worn suit, the calloused hands, and the simple look on his father's face, which seemed so out of place there. The smile Caio had been wearing while talking to his friends faded, and he glanced around, noticing that a few of his classmates had also noticed Antonio's presence. Antonio smiled widely, filled with love, and took a step forward to hug his son. But Caio, with a quick and almost imperceptible gesture, stepped back slightly, avoiding the contact. He leaned toward his father and whispered, his voice cold and irritated. "Dad, can't you see you don't fit in here? Why don't you just stay back, away from everyone?" Those words felt like a stab to Antonio's chest. He stopped, his arms still slightly raised, not immediately understanding what he had just heard. His smile slowly faded, and something in his eyes, once filled with pride, now mixed with a deep sadness. He looked around, noticing the strange and even mocking looks some people were giving him. "Of course, son," he replied, his voice low, trying to hide the hurt he felt. "I'm just happy to be here for you." Caio crossed his arms, impatient, and cast a look that seemed to beg his father to disappear from everyone's view. Antonio lowered his gaze, swallowed hard, and nodded, as if he were guilty of something he didn't understand. He tried to force a smile, but the sparkle in his eyes had faded. At that moment, one of Caio's friends, a young woman elegantly dressed and flawlessly made up, looked at Antonio with a mix of curiosity and disdain. She moved closer to Caio and, with a condescending smile, commented in a low voice, but loud enough for Antonio to hear. "So, that's your dad? How interesting." She let out a quick, ironic laugh and added, "I didn't imagine someone like you came from such a simple family." Caio's face tightened, and he gave a half-hearted smile without responding. Antonio noticed his son's discomfort and the effect his presence was having. His heart felt heavy, but he forced himself to take a step back, respecting his son's wishes, even though it tore him apart inside. He slowly backed away, feeling small, an invisible, misplaced figure in that grand setting. As he stepped back, he cast one last glance at Caio, as if hoping for a kind word, a smile of encouragement, something to reassure him. But his son's expression was impassive, almost as if he wanted to pretend his father wasn't there. Antonio found a seat in the back rows, where no one seemed to notice him. He sat down, feeling the weight of rejection and trying to calm his heart, which kept beating fast. For a moment, he thought of getting up and leaving, sparing his son from the embarrassment. But when he remembered the dream he had nurtured for so many years, he took a deep breath and decided to stay, even if from afar, just to witness that moment that was so important to him. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to regain his composure, and murmured to himself with a sad dignity, "I'm here for you, Caio. I always have been, and I always will be." From his seat at the back of the auditorium, he looked at his son, who had already returned to smiling and chatting animatedly with friends, as if the brief encounter with his father was just an insignificant detail in his night of glory. Antonio, though hurt, tried to see the positive side. Caio was happy, surrounded by people who admired him. That's what mattered, right? That was the reason behind all his sacrifices. But a part of him, deep down, was starting to realize that maybe his son's success had come at a higher price than he'd expected. The auditorium was packed, Parents, friends, and family filled the seats, eager to see the young graduates receive their diplomas, each one representing years of effort, sacrifice, and dedication. The lights dimmed, and triumphant music filled the room, signaling the most anticipated moment of the evening. Antonio felt a shiver when he heard his son's name echo through the auditorium's sound system. Graduate Caio de Silva Santos announced the master of ceremonies, his voice full of pomp and respect. Without a second thought, Antonio stood up immediately from his seat at the back of the auditorium. His hands were trembling, but pride made him forget the anxiety, the sadness, the embarrassment he'd felt just minutes before. He clapped with all his might, his smile wide, his eyes shining with emotion and tears of joy. In that instant, it felt as though all the effort, all the sacrifices, and all the weary nights had been worth it. "That's my son, my boy," he murmured to himself, overcome with emotion, as if each clap were a silent declaration of love and pride. Caio, as he stepped onto the stage, hesitated for a second. The sound of his father's applause stood out in the auditorium, loud, enthusiastic, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. He glanced over from the corner of his eye, and his face tightened. His hands stopped mid-applause, and his eyes, which should have been shining with pride, showed only embarrassment. Around him, some people began to whisper, and a few discreet giggles escaped here and there. A woman in an elegant suit whispered mockingly to her friend beside her, "Look at that man at the back, in that old suit. Who'd have thought someone so successful would come from such a humble family?" Another man, with a scowl, grimaced and muttered, "Shameful. After all he did to be here, and his father couldn't even bother to wear something decent." Caio caught the comments around him and clenched his teeth, feeling his face flush with shame. In almost an instinctive move, he made a sharp gesture toward his father, as if to tell him to stop. Antonio, however, didn't immediately understand the meaning of the gesture. He thought his son was simply trying to greet him from afar, and with an innocent smile, he waved back, proud and full of emotion. The laughter grew louder, this time a bit more noticeable, and Caio suddenly turned his back to the audience, pretending to adjust his gown in a complete effort to ignore his father. It was as if he wanted Antonio to disappear from his view, and everyone else's too. He fixed his eyes on the master of ceremonies, avoiding even the slightest glance toward the back of the auditorium. Antonio, at last, understood his son's discomfort. The applause faded, and he could feel the weight of critical looks and biting whispers around him. His calloused hands, which had been clapping with such enthusiasm, gradually stopped. He lowered his arms, uncertain, his eyes falling to the floor as if he wished he could disappear. Deep down, he felt invisible, like an outsider in the life he had helped build. But it was too late. The shame had already reached him. Antonio, still standing, tried to regain his composure. He looked toward the stage in Caio's direction with an apologetic expression, as if acknowledging the burden his presence placed on his son. He felt humiliated, yet he searched for a reason to stay, still believing that Caio was just nervous about the ceremony, that he would later understand just how much this moment meant to his father. The laughter and whispers, however, didn't stop. One of Caio's classmates, dressed in a perfectly pressed gown and with a smug look, turned to a group of other graduates and said, with a sarcastic smile, "Well, at least now we get why Caio always works so hard. With a family like that, he must have had a lot of motivation to rise above." Caio heard the words, and a shadow of resentment crossed his face. The enthusiastic applause and critical whispers seemed to remind him every second of the humble background he worked so hard to hide. Antonio, now silent, watched with a breaking heart as he realized that, in that crowded auditorium, he was only an unwelcome presence in his own son's eyes. He looked once more at Caio, hoping for some final gesture of recognition, a word, a smile, anything. But Kaio remained impassive, not turning, making it clear to everyone that he preferred the humble, embarrassed man to remain a shadow in the background. With a heavy heart, Antonio lowered his eyes and slowly took his seat. In that moment, the joy he'd felt hearing his son's name was replaced by a bitter ache. He clutched his old suit over his chest, as if trying to keep back the tears that threatened to come. The pride that had once been so strong began to mingle with a deep sadness, a realization that, perhaps, this son he loved so much had chosen a path where there was no place for him. The master of ceremonies went on calling the graduates' names, but Antonio barely heard. The voices around him, the laughter, the lights all became a blur as he sat there, unmoving, trying to convince himself that no matter what Kaio did or said, he would still be his father. Even if Kaio treated him as if he didn't matter, he would keep loving his son just as deeply as ever. But a question lingered in his mind, a doubt that had never occurred to him until that moment. Would love be enough if that love wasn't mutual? The ceremony took a brief pause before the final speeches. Graduates and their families spread out around the auditorium, some chatting, others taking the opportunity to snap photos. Antonio stayed in his seat, huddled in the back row, not quite able to gather the courage to stand, but his gaze fixed on the stage where Kaio had been. For a moment, he wondered if he should go over to his son, say something to lift his spirits, but the whispers and chuckles from earlier still echoed painfully in his mind. Suddenly, Kaio appeared backstage, and a small gesture from him was enough for Antonio to realize that his son wanted to talk to him. A thread of hope sparked in the father's heart. Maybe he wants to apologize, Antonio thought, or perhaps explain what had happened, ease the strange distance that had come between them. With hesitant steps, Antonio made his way to where Kaio was waiting, in a secluded area, away from everyone's view. But the look on his son's face wasn't one of remorse or apology. Kaio looked at him with a cold, visibly uncomfortable expression, almost as if he was about to carry out an unpleasant task. Antonio tried to start the conversation, his voice still gentle, with the same smile he'd always offered his son. Kaio, I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. I don't know if you can imagine the happiness I feel seeing you on that stage, as a doctor. Kaio raised a hand abruptly, cutting him off. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, as if trying to gather the patience to handle the situation. Then, he finally spoke, bluntly, with a tone that edged on irritation. Dad, please. I just wish you'd stayed home today. The words came out quickly, almost spat out. He glanced around, checking if anyone was nearby. Don't you get it? I'm trying to build an image here. Your presence, it gets in the way, you understand? Antonio felt the words hit him like a punch. For a moment, everything around him seemed to spin. His heart raced as he tried to process whether this was some misunderstanding, if his son was indeed asking him to leave, as though he were a burden. Antonio still tried to smile, though it was fragile, trembling. Kaio, I didn't mean to get in the way. I thought you'd like me to be here to support you, to celebrate this achievement with you. He hesitated, and a shadow of sadness crossed his face. I've never missed an opportunity to be by your side, son. Kaio shook his head, impatiently, without looking directly at his father, as if he wanted to avoid eye contact to spare himself from seeing the pain on Antonio's face. He sighed, frustrated, and crossed his arms, taking on an even harsher tone. Dad, don't you get it? This isn't your place. The people here, they don't understand. I didn't spend years studying and working hard to be judged by your presence. Can't you see how this affects me? The silence between them grew unbearable. Antonio stood motionless, feeling his son's words resonate painfully within him. The pride, love, and joy he felt in coming to the ceremony seemed to crumble in that moment, under Kaio's cold treatment. Antonio's hands tightened into fists, not out of anger, but in a desperate attempt to hold back tears. Finally, he lowered his head, taking a deep breath, bearing the weight of the hurt while still trying to understand his son. His voice came out weak, almost a whisper, full of resigned sadness. "I'm sorry, son. I didn't mean to cause you trouble. I just wanted to see you achieve your dream." He hesitated, looking at Kaio with tearful but loving eyes. "Everything I've done was for you, Kaio. But if this is what you want, if you really think my presence here is a burden, I'll leave." Kaio let out a sigh of relief, though slightly embarrassed. He avoided meeting his father's vulnerable gaze, preferring to focus on an indifferent expression. Yet even on his face, a faint tension became visible, as if something inside him was breaking, though he tried to suppress it. "Thanks, Dad," he murmured, almost emotionlessly. "It's just better this way." Antonio nodded, without another word, and turned to leave. As he walked back to the auditorium, shoulders slumped and face devastated, each step felt heavier. He could no longer hold the smile that, moments earlier, radiated pride. He felt small, almost invisible to his own son. Back in the auditorium, Antonio sat in the last row, distant, and looked toward the stage with an empty gaze. The brightness in his eyes had disappeared, replaced by a veil of silent sorrow. He was determined to stay until the end, even if it was from afar, even if his heart was shattered. After all, he had promised himself he would see Kaio on this big day. For a moment, he put his hand on his chest, feeling a pain that wasn't physical, but that seemed to cut deeper than any wound. He looked around, seeing families chatting happily, hugging their children with sincere smiles and proud eyes. He knew this was a time for everyone to celebrate, but there, isolated and forgotten, he felt like a stranger in the very life he had helped to build. Trying to hold back his tears, Antonio closed his eyes and, in his thoughts, sought comfort in a silent prayer. "God, I know I did everything I could. If this is his choice, so be it." The ceremony continued, but for Antonio, everything now seemed distant, like a muffled noise, a celebration he could never truly be part of. He stood at the back of the auditorium, accepting the pain his own unconditional love had caused him, resigned to the choice of a son who, at that moment, felt as distant as a stranger. Sitting in the last row, Antonio remained still, his gaze fixed on the stage where the graduates were positioned. But his eyes were empty, far away. The echo of Kaio's words still hammered in his mind, filling his heart with a pain he'd never thought possible. He had faced so many hardships in life: hunger, cold, endless days of work in the fields. But nothing had prepared him for the blow of his son's cold words. Around him, the ceremony carried on with pomp and grace. The sound of orchestral music filled the room, and the applause of family and friends for the graduates reverberated throughout the auditorium. Antonio watched from a distance as the graduates smiled for the cameras, proudly posing with their diplomas. He felt out of place, like an intruder, yet his heart still beat with love and pride for his son. He swallowed hard and tried to focus on the image of Kaio, chatting excitedly with friends near the front of the stage. He watched him from afar, seeing the radiant smile on his son's face, the same smile he'd known since childhood, and a flicker of hope lit up in him, only to be quickly extinguished. The gap between them at that moment was greater than physical space. It was a deep chasm, created by the shame his son felt for his own roots. Maybe he's right. Maybe I really don't belong here, thought Antonio, gripping the edge of his seat, as if the touch of the worn-up upholstery could somehow give him the strength to hold back the avalanche of emotions crushing him inside. The auditorium was filled with sounds of laughter, joy, and shared pride between parents and children. Antonio looked around, watching other parents embracing their children, taking photos together, exchanging loving words. In contrast, he stood alone in the shadows, like a forgotten figure, someone who had only served as a stepping stone for his son to rise and was now nothing more than an unwanted memory. Beside him, A woman, visibly moved, whispered to her husband, wiping her eyes as she watched their daughter receive her diploma. "Just look at her. Our girl made it. I can't wait to make a special dinner tonight, with the whole family together." The husband smiled and gave her a tight hug. "Yes, my love. This is our reward for all these years, isn't it? We did a good job." Antonio looked away, his throat tight with a knot of emotions he couldn't express. He had also dreamed of something like this. He had imagined himself smiling beside Caio, maybe posing for photos and later celebrating with a simple dinner, perhaps even sharing stories of the struggles and victories that had brought him here. But that dream, so innocent and full of warmth, felt cruel now, an illusion he could never reach. His heart was broken, yet he still refused to leave. Deep down, he still believed that the love he felt for his son was enough to withstand this humiliation. "I came for him," Antonio thought. "And for him, I can endure this." Even if it meant watching Caio's success like a shadow, hidden and forgotten, he wouldn't back down. He would stay until the very last moment, until the final applause. But as he looked at the stage once more, a voice in his mind, bitter and silent, told him that maybe he had failed somewhere along the way. What did I do wrong? He wondered. Did I protect him too much? Or maybe I didn't love him enough? Was it my simple way that pushed him away? These thoughts tormented him, but he found no answer. He stood there, motionless, as the graduates received their diplomas one by one. With every name called, more applause filled the room. More parents stood up proudly, calling out to their children, taking photos, laughing, and hugging. But Antonio remained silent, without the strength to join them. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a solitary tear slide down his face. He quickly wiped it away, not wanting anyone to notice his weakness. As humble as he was, he didn't want to show his suffering in public. He kept his pain to himself, as he always had, just like the years he had hidden Caio's struggles so he could grow up without worries. Upon hearing his son's name called again, Antonio lifted his head, his heart beating once more with that unstoppable pride, that unconditional love he could never erase, no matter how hard Caio tried to push him away. He clapped silently, just moving his hands, as if that small gesture could convey everything he felt. A father, even hurt, even overlooked, still there, firm to applaud his boy. But at that moment, Caio didn't look to the back of the auditorium. He didn't search for his father's gaze. He was with his friends, receiving congratulations from teachers, the praise of classmates who surrounded him with smiles and applause. For Caio, his father no longer existed in that moment of glory. The master of ceremonies' voice echoed again, announcing the end of the diploma ceremony and inviting all the graduates onto the stage for the closing speech. Antonio, with teary eyes, watched his son climb the stage once more, standing tall with a proud expression. This was his son, the same boy he had once carried in his arms, who called him hero on stormy nights when the lights went out, and only the flash of lightning lit up the sky outside. In that moment, a thought crossed Antonio's mind, mingled with the bitterness of his memories. I did everything to see him here. But does he still remember everything I sacrificed so he could be where he is? And there, in the painful silence of his heart, Antonio felt the weight of loneliness like never before. The auditorium was buzzing with constant applause and celebratory laughter, and the graduates gathered around each other, sharing hugs and taking photos. It was the closing moment of the ceremony, and the dean, a tall man with a deep voice, took the stage once more, holding the microphone with the confidence and formality of someone used to the attention of large crowds. He raised one hand, asking for silence, and gradually the sound of conversations faded away. A sense of curiosity settled over the audience as the dean adjusted his glasses and looked at the graduates with a subtle smile. His voice echoed through the auditorium, filled with pride and solemnity. Ladies and gentlemen, before we officially close the ceremony, I would like to announce something special, he declared. One of our graduates approached us with a particular request. He wishes to give a speech in tribute to someone who was essential in his journey. A murmur of surprise spread through the auditorium as people turned their eyes to the graduates on the stage. People exchanged glances, curious to know who might have made this request. After all, it was rare for a student to request a personal speech slot during the ceremony. Antonio, sitting in his seat at the back, held his breath when he heard those words. A tribute, he thought, his heart beating faster. Hope was rekindled in his chest. Could it be Caio? Had he changed his mind and decided to thank him publicly? It was an unlikely possibility, but in that moment, Antonio allowed himself to dream. The dean smiled and turned to the stage, gesturing with his hand. Then, with great honor, I invite to the stage graduate Caio de Silva Santos. Antonio's eyes widened, and a powerful emotion took hold of him. His son, the very son who had asked him to stay hidden, was stepping onto the stage to give a special tribute. A wave of pride flooded him, and he felt tears returning to his eyes. Finally, he thought, Caio would recognize all the sacrifice and love he had given him. Maybe his son had finally realized the importance of his father in such a symbolic moment. Caio stood up and walked to the center of the stage, holding his diploma in one hand and the microphone in the other. He looked nervous but kept his posture straight and his chin slightly lifted, like someone who was in control of the room. His classmates watched him in silence, some curious, others just impatient for the ceremony to end. Antonio, in the back, awaited every word with an almost reverent focus, his heart racing and his eyes fixed on his son. Caio looked out at the audience, took a dramatic pause, and finally began to speak. His voice echoed clear and steady through the auditorium. I'd like to take this special moment to talk about an important person in my life, he said, letting the words linger in the air, carefully building suspense. The audience waited in silence, and Antonio leaned forward slightly, gripping the edge of his chair, unable to contain his anticipation. Every word his son spoke felt like a thread pulling him deeper into that moment, holding him in a hopeful expectation of heartfelt recognition. Caio paused, as if searching for the right words, then continued in a slightly softer tone. Not everyone here knows what it's like to come from a challenging background, from a humble family, with limitations that don't always allow us to achieve everything we want without a lot of sacrifice. Those words sounded strange, almost distant, and Antonio began to feel a stirring unease in his chest. But he still believed Caio was about to say something sincere, perhaps mention his father's years of hard work and the sacrifices he had made to ensure his son's education. Antonio waited, full of hope, his eyes shining, convinced that those initial words were the prelude to a touching acknowledgement. But then, Caio cast a quick glance towards the back of the auditorium, where Antonio sat, and continued with a tone that now seemed laden with indifference. Some of us had to overcome certain limitations, he said, and as he uttered limitations, a faint, bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, as if referring to something he was ashamed of. We can't always choose where we come from, but we can choose who we want to be. The audience remained silent, though some curious glances turned toward the back of the auditorium, as if trying to identify who Caio was referring to. Antonio felt a tightening in his chest, as if understanding the true tone behind his son's words. That limitation Caio spoke of was none other than himself, his father, the simple man who had devoted his life to seeing his son reach that very moment. Caio continued, now more confidently, as if wanting to reinforce his stance. I know that many of you come from families who gave you everything, who opened doors, who offered opportunities. My story is different. I had to overcome many barriers to get here. To become who I am today, I had to leave behind everything that could hold me back. Antonio felt the ground disappear beneath him. He could barely breathe. Those words, spoken by his own son, were not a tribute. They were a distancing, a veiled way of belittling him, of reducing his life, his sacrifices, to nothing more than an obstacle. Kaio spoke of him as if he were an anchor he had to cut loose to take flight. The audience began to murmur, caught between surprise and a bitter curiosity. Some, closer to Kaio, exchanged discreet glances, as if they finally understood the source of his drive, but also of his shame. Kaio's words left no doubt. He despised his humble origins, his father's simple life, and worse, saw it as a stain on his identity, something he was trying at all costs to erase. Antonio felt tears welling in his eyes, but forced himself to hold them back. His chest ached. Each heartbeat seemed to answer with pain to those words. He kept looking at his son, even though his gaze of pride was now shattered. The pain of hearing those words from his own son was unbearable, yet he couldn't look away. I know I owe my education, my upbringing, to my own determination. Kaio continued in a tone that seemed even more calculated. Everything I've achieved is the result of my own efforts. And I want everyone to know that I am here because I chose to be the best. I chose to rise above my roots. In that moment, Antonio understood that his son would never see him as he saw Kaio. To Kaio, he wasn't a devoted father, a man who sacrificed to see his son shine. He was just a reminder of a life Kaio wanted to forget, a page Kaio had decided to rip out of his story. When Kaio finished his speech, the applause was formal, less enthusiastic than before. Many in the audience appeared visibly uncomfortable, sensing the coldness and ingratitude hidden beneath those words. Kaio, however, left the stage with a faint smile, without looking back to where Antonio remained, alone, his heart crushed. Antonio stayed there, enveloped in the silence of his own pain, feeling small, invisible, yet still filled with love. The auditorium remained in silence, an air of anticipation hanging over everyone as Kaio adjusted the microphone in his hands, carefully choosing each word. He was aware that every sentence would have an impact, and he seemed to meticulously calculate the tone, the rhythm, as if rehearsing a private performance. This was more than just a speech for Kaio. It was his chance to assert, in front of everyone, the image he had fought so hard to build. When we look at where we are, some people here might not fully grasp what it means to overcome limitations. But I come from a place where things weren't easy, a place I had to leave behind to become who I am today, he said, his voice steady as his gaze briefly fixed on the back of the auditorium, where he knew his father was seated. Antonio gripped the edges of his seat, as if needing that physical support to withstand the weight of his son's words, which, though veiled, were unmistakably directed at him. With each sentence Kaio spoke, his heart tightened a bit more. The faint smile on Antonio's face faded, replaced by a dark, rigid expression as he tried to comprehend the depth of this public humiliation. Kaio continued, unblinking, his face bright with the thrill of his own achievement. Not everyone here knows what it's like to have to rise above one's own roots, he declared, this time casting a cold look toward his father. To have to break free from certain roots that often hold us back rather than help us grow. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uneasy with the tone of his speech. Attentive listeners could tell that Kaio's words weren't just about overcoming difficulties. They were an open rejection of something, or someone he saw as a burden. In the front row, a few teachers exchanged puzzled glances. Kaio was a stellar student, driven, but the way he spoke about overcoming had a strange, almost bitter weight to it. At the back, Antonio felt each word like a knife, but he kept looking at his son in silence, as if this were the last glimmer of hope he could cling to. Yet it felt as if, instead of extending a hand, Kaio was digging an even deeper divide between them. Kaio lifted his chin, his voice firm and proud, as though he were making a statement of independence to everyone present. I got here because I chose, above all else, to be someone different. Success often demands that we break free from the chains of the past and move forward without looking back. That's what I did, and today I can say that I am the product of my own determination, of my own effort. A dramatic pause followed, and Kaio finally lowered his gaze, as if trying to show a trace of humility, but his voice quickly returned to its firm, unyielding tone. Antonio held his breath, waiting, perhaps still hoping that Kaio might finally acknowledge the sacrifices his father had made for him. But what followed only reinforced the distance, the coldness, the ingratitude. If I've learned anything on this journey, Kaio continued, it's that to reach success, we need to leave behind what defines us just by who we are, not by what we can become. Often, our roots hold us back, trapping us, but I'm proof that it's possible to overcome any obstacle, even those that come from our own family. The impact of his last words struck the auditorium like a clap of thunder. A murmur of discomfort spread through the audience, with some guests exchanging glances of surprise and shock. Many there were parents, and the thought of being seen as an obstacle by their own children unsettled them. Some lowered their gaze, unable to hide the embarrassment they felt for Antonio, now perceived as the humble figure his son treated as a shackle. Antonio, however, didn't move. His tear-filled eyes stayed fixed on Kaio, but now his expression was one of resignation. He finally understood that his son didn't see him as a father. He saw him as a source of shame, something he needed to distance himself from to feel worthy of that diploma. It broke his heart, but still, he couldn't look away. Everything he had done, every sacrifice, sleepless night, and day without food so his son could have study materials, all his dedication, it had all been reduced to nothing more than a burden, something Kaio rejected as an embarrassing chapter of his own story. With one final sigh, Antonio lowered his gaze, trying to hold back the tears that insisted on escaping. There was still love in his heart, but now that love was covered by the pain of knowing it wouldn't be returned. And somehow, he accepted that pain. After all, he hadn't done all that for gratitude or recognition. He did it out of love, a love he knew he couldn't erase, no matter how hard Kaio tried to humiliate him. On stage, Kaio ended his speech with an arrogant smile, blind to the devastation he'd caused his own father. The auditorium remained silent for a moment, and then a few timid, cautious claps began. Few people knew what to do or how to react to such harsh, disdainful words. From his seat in the back, Antonio mustered a last, lonely applause, the muffled sound of his hands coming together almost inaudible in the vast auditorium. He wanted to show that, despite everything, he was somehow still proud of Kaio. But in his heart, he knew that nothing he had done could fill the void his son had created between them. The silence was deafening, and at that moment, as Kaio stepped down from the stage and received congratulations from his peers, Antonio felt definitively invisible. He was there, but it was as if no one could see him, not even his son. The auditorium began to stir as Kaio stepped down, with a few scattered applause still echoing hesitantly. People nearby whispered, exchanging looks of incomprehension and discomfort. Kaio's classmates tried to approach him, congratulating him on the speech, but many wore cautious expressions, unsure of exactly how to react to the message that had seemed so full of disdain. In the last row, Antonio felt the overwhelming weight of everything he had just heard, but he stayed firm. The pain was unbearable, yet something within him was growing, a quiet urge to say what his heart had been carrying. For years, he had swallowed every humiliation and sorrow, every pain he had borne alone for the love of his son. But now, as he watched Kaio flaunt his independence as if his father meant nothing, he realized there was something that needed to be said. Not to the others, but to his own son. Taking a deep breath, Antonio rose slowly, adjusting his old suit as if he were preparing for a final battle. The light from the stage barely reached him, but the silence his movement created drew the attention of a few people nearby. Antonio felt their gazes. Yet he took the first step with the dignity of someone who had never been ashamed of who he was. With a weak yet determined voice, he spoke, his words breaking the silence unexpectedly. "Excuse me," he began, and the humility in his voice made more people turn. Noticing this simple man, worn by time and labor, but standing there with a dignified posture that contrasted with the simplicity of his appearance. He looked directly at the stage, where Kaio was still surrounded by his friends, unsure how to react to his father speaking up during the ceremony. "I know I'm nobody important here," Antonio continued, his voice echoing through the auditorium amidst the growing murmurs. "But I'd like to say a few words to my son." The tension in the room was palpable, and Kaio, visibly unsettled, tried to intervene, taking a step forward and raising his hand as if to stop his father before he could say anything. But the dean, intrigued, motioned for Antonio to go on, and the rest of the auditorium watched in complete silence, their eyes fixed on this man who dared to interrupt the ceremony's formality. Antonio took a deep breath, sadness and dignity intertwined in his gaze. He looked at his son with an expression that blended pain and deep love, something no amount of ingratitude could erase. "Kaio, I know you feel ashamed of me," he began, his voice shaky yet sincere. "Perhaps you never understood, but everything I've done in my life was for you. Every night I stayed awake. Every hour I worked under the sun. It was all so that you could have the chance to choose your own path." Antonio paused, an emotion shone in his eyes as he looked at his son with a depth that no one there had ever witnessed. His chest felt heavy, but at the same time, he seemed finally to release a pain he had carried for so long without ever expressing it. "I never had the chance to study, to wear a graduation gown, or to have a celebration like this. I never had any of that," he continued, now with a choked-up voice but still firm. "But I gave you everything I could, even what I didn't have, so that today you could be where you are." Those words, loaded with undeniable truth, echoed throughout the auditorium. Some people began to look away, unsettled by the rawness of what they were hearing. Parents in the audience felt a lump in their throats, reflecting on their own sacrifices and realizing they were witnessing a man whose life had been devoted to unconditional love. With each word from Antonio, more and more eyes turned to him, while Kaio on stage began to feel the weight of every phrase, every sacrifice his father was now revealing. "I don't want recognition, son," Antonio said, his voice trembling slightly as he struggled to stay composed. "I never did this expecting gratitude. I just wanted to see you happy. I just wanted to be here to applaud you, to see you living your dream." He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on his son. "If I have to leave now to make that happen, then I will. But I want you never to forget one thing, Kaio. I love you. I always have, and nothing in the world will change that." Upon hearing those words, a heavy silence filled the auditorium. People were motionless, unable to look away from the man who, despite feeling humiliated and hurt, still found the strength to express his unwavering love for his son. Kaio, however, seemed torn between shock and wounded pride. He kept a rigid expression, his eyes fixed on the ground, trying to avoid his father's gaze, but failing to mask the turmoil on his face. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if all the layers of superiority he had built over the years were being stripped away by the simplicity and truth of his father's words. Antonio lowered his eyes, as if everything he needed to say had already been said. He made a move to turn and leave, knowing that, after those words, his presence was no longer needed there. But before he could take the first step, the dean, who had been observing the scene with teary eyes, intervened, moved by the dignity of the man standing before them. "Mr. Antonio," said the dean, his voice thick with emotion, "I think we all have something to learn from you today." He turned to the audience with a serious gaze and added, "This man you see, he is a true example of love and sacrifice." The applause started slowly, but soon spread throughout the auditorium, growing in intensity. People who moments before had looked at Antonio with disdain or indifference now stood up to applaud him, some with tears in their eyes. Everyone was moved by Antonio's gesture, his humility, and the depth of his love. He was no longer invisible. He was a quiet hero, a symbol of the purest form of a father's love. Caio, seeing the reaction from the audience, finally lifted his eyes to his father, now confused and visibly shaken. Those words hurt him in a way he had never expected, as if, for the first time, he was truly seeing the man who had raised him. But Antonio's silence no longer needed to be filled with anything more. It was complete, even in its pain, for his truth had been spoken. Amid the applause and the tears of strangers, he remained standing, with the posture of someone who had finally, after so many years, found peace. The applause still echoed through the auditorium, but Antonio, overtaken by intense emotion, seemed not to hear it. His gaze was fixed on Caio, who stood on the stage, avoiding eye contact with his father. Caio's face was rigid, but behind that facade of indifference, a conflict was brewing, something he could no longer hide. He felt the weight of everyone's gaze around him, the expectations, the judgments he himself had provoked with his words of disdain. Antonio, driven by the power of the moment and the need to reveal the truth he had carried in silence for years, gripped the microphone tighter. He knew he might never have another chance to say what his heart had held on to. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak, his voice shaky yet resolute, as if each word were a brick in the bridge he was building between him and his son. "Caio," he began, his gaze sad but full of a determination no one expected. "Maybe you never knew everything I had to face, so you could be here today. I never told you because I didn't want you to carry that burden. But now, I think it's important for you to know." The auditorium fell silent. Everyone was still, their eyes fixed on this humble man who, unafraid to expose his own pain, was preparing to tell the truth of his life, piece by piece, like someone revealing scars that had been hidden for a long time. "When you were little," Antonio continued, his eyes welling up, "I worked from 5 in the morning until nightfall. There was no rest. Every penny I earned, I saved for you. I remember once you asked for a new notebook to study. We didn't have the money, but I sold my only pair of boots to buy you that notebook." Caio's face went pale, feeling the ground vanish beneath his feet. He remembered that notebook, of course. It was the first hardcover one he'd ever had, and he had shown it off proudly to his classmates. But he had never imagined that his father had made such a sacrifice to give him that small luxury. Antonio continued, and now the emotion overflowed in his voice. "When you got into college, Caio, it was the happiest day of my life. I knew it would be expensive, that it would be a hard road. But I promised myself that nothing would stop me from giving you this chance. So I did what I could and what I couldn't." He paused, taking a deep breath, and the dean beside him discreetly wiped away a tear. Antonio's raw honesty touched everyone in the auditorium. People, once indifferent, now looked at him with a respect and admiration he had never known. "I sold our piece of land," Antonio continued, his voice breaking as he mentioned it. "That little bit of land was the only thing my family owned. I thought it wouldn't matter, because you would have a chance better than anything I could ever dream of. Today, I have nothing left. The house where you grew up, Caio, now belongs to the bank. I'm still there, but it's no longer mine." A wave of shock passed through the audience. Antonio, a simple and humble man, had sacrificed everything, even the roof over his head, to ensure his son could fulfill his dream. Caio's eyes widened, and a shadow of shame finally appeared on his face. He had never known about the debts, about these sacrifices. His father had always sent him money, but never mentioned the price he was paying for it. Antonio took another deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady, though it was filled with pain. There were times when I had nothing to eat, but I still sent you what I could, even more than I could. I took out loans, Kyle, many of them. Today I still carry those debts. But none of that mattered because every time I saw you, I remembered that it was all for a reason, for a purpose. With each word, Kaio seemed to shrink on stage. The look of arrogance and self-assurance he had worn throughout his speech had vanished, replaced by a mix of shame, regret, and surprise. He looked at his father, his eyes welling with tears, but he still hesitated to approach, as though his pride held back what little humanity he had left. Antonio took another deep breath and finished, looking at his son with an expression that was a blend of sadness and tenderness. Kyle, I never asked you for anything. I never expected you to repay what I sacrificed. My only wish was to see you happy, to see you become the person I always dreamed you would be. But seeing you today, rejecting everything that brought us here, hurts me more than any debt, more than any sacrifice. Antonio's voice finally choked up, and he stopped, unable to say anything more. The silence in the auditorium was heavy, and many present now had tears in their eyes. Parents there looked at Antonio with admiration, recognizing the magnitude of his unconditional love and the pain he bore. Finally, Kaio stepped down from the stage. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his shoulders hunched, as though the weight of the truth revealed had crushed him. He walked slowly toward his father, unable to look him in the eye, but also unable to pretend that those words hadn't affected him. When he stopped in front of Antonio, Kaio lifted his face, and his eyes were full of tears. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to escape him, as if there was nothing that could express the shame and pain now filling his heart. "Dad," he murmured, his voice barely audible, choked by guilt. I didn't know. I was such a fool." Antonio looked at him, and despite everything, love was still there, visible in his tired gaze. He reached out, a simple and humble gesture, and placed his hand on his son's shoulder, a touch of understanding and forgiveness. "Son," Antonio said, his voice soft and without a hint of resentment, "you're my pride, always have been. I never needed you to thank me. I just want you to know how much I love you, and that, for me, that will never change." Kaio, unable to hold back his tears, sank into his father's arms, in an embrace that held years of sacrifice, love, and now, finally, regret. The auditorium erupted in applause, many people crying at the intensity of that moment of reconciliation and revelation. In that moment, everything Kaio had felt, shame, pride, coldness, dissolved in a whirlwind of emotions. At last, he understood the true meaning of each sacrifice his father had made and what it really meant to be worthy of such love. Kaio continued hugging his father, his body trembling as silent tears rolled down his face. It was as if, at that moment, all the hardness he had built over the years, the pride, the vanity, the shame of his own roots, crumbled, leaving him vulnerable, laid bare before his own humanity. His father's embrace enveloped him in a warmth he didn't even know he still needed. For the first time, he truly felt the weight and value of that love. Kaio pulled back slightly, his eyes still brimming with tears, and looked at Antonio with a deep expression of regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice came out weak, broken, as if the words were trapped by emotion. "Dad, forgive me," he whispered, his voice heavy with pain. I was a fool, an ingrate. Nothing I achieved would have been possible without you. I don't know how I could have been so blind." Antonio smiled, a calm smile full of understanding. There was a peace there that came from years of sacrifice and an unwavering acceptance of what it means to truly love someone. He ran his hand through his son's hair, a gentle, paternal gesture that contrasted with the enormity of the moment. "Kyle," he said, his voice soft and comforting, "a father's love doesn't demand perfection. I never expected anything in return, just for you to be happy." He squeezed his son's shoulder, his own eyes misty. "I'm here now, by your side, and that's all that matters to me." Kyle shook his head, unable to hold back the tears that continued to fall. He couldn't understand how his father, even after everything he had said, still stood there, unwavering, full of love and forgiveness. He looked around and noticed that everyone was watching, many with tears in their eyes, moved by the intensity of this reunion. Each face in the crowd reflected his own shame, his own regret. On an impulse, Kaio turned to the audience and lifted the microphone, taking a deep breath. His voice still trembling, he began to speak, addressing the crowd but especially his father. "Everyone here heard what I said earlier," he began, his voice breaking momentarily, heavy with emotion. I want you all to know that I was unfair. I was ungrateful. My father," Kyle looked at Antonio, his eyes glistening. "My father gave everything he had, and more, so I could be here today. He worked himself to the bone, sacrificed every last penny, all for me. And I was unable to recognize the worth of that love." He paused, trying to pull himself together, but the emotion was too strong. He lowered his head for a moment, took a deep breath, and when he looked up again, the expression of regret was unmistakable. "Dad," he said, turning fully toward Antonio, "there are no words that can undo what I did, what I said. But here, in front of everyone, I want to promise that I will honor every sacrifice you made, every sleepless night, every meal you skipped to give me a chance. I promise I will never again forget the love and dedication you gave me." Kaio's words brought a new wave of emotion to the auditorium. People who had previously been whispering or laughing now wiped away discreet tears, touched by the sincerity of that moment of redemption. Antonio's humble presence had become a symbol, a living testament to the power of unconditional love, and Kaio's public acknowledgement of his mistake made everyone there reflect on the value of family and sacrifice. The dean, visibly moved, took the microphone and, with a voice choked with emotion, addressed Antonio. "Mr. Antonio," he said, "you are indeed a true hero. Your son's achievements are a shared accomplishment. Your dedication and sacrifice are an example we will never forget." He paused, turning to the audience. "If there is anyone here worthy of being called great, that person is you." Hearing these words, the entire audience rose and began to applaud, a sincere and heartfelt tribute to Antonio. The applause echoed throughout the auditorium, and many in the crowd openly wept, moved by the story they were witnessing. It was a standing ovation, a recognition of the greatness of this man who, with simplicity and humility, had shown everyone what a father's love truly is. Kaio, still standing beside his father, held his hands and squeezed them tightly. He knew that this moment was much more than just a ceremony. It was a reconciliation he never imagined he would need to seek. Looking into his father's eyes, he realized he was finally seeing him as he truly was, a remarkable man whose worth extended far beyond titles, clothes, or social standing. "Dad," he said with a shy yet genuine smile, "I promise to honor every day of my life in tribute to everything you've done for me. From today on, every patient I care for, every life I save, will be proof of your love, your sacrifice." Antonio smiled, his face lit up by the happiness he had finally found. He wrapped his son in a tight embrace, one that held all the love, forgiveness, and reconciliation they both needed. In that moment, there were no more hurts, no more resentments, just the sacred bond between father and son, renewed and strengthened. The audience continued applauding, some still standing, as the dean moved approached the two, holding the microphone. With a solemn voice, he declared, "Let this ceremony conclude with a tribute to this father, Antonio, who is a true hero in every sense of the word. May each of us carry with us the example of unconditional love and sacrifice that he represents." Applause echoed once again, filling the room with an energy of peace and gratitude. As father and son walked away, side by side, Antonio's face showed serenity. He felt that all those years of work, all the lonely nights, and all the sacrifices had finally been worth it. They left together, leaving behind an auditorium marked by the depth of that moment and carrying with them the promise of a new beginning. Kaio knew he had much to do to make up for his mistakes, but at that moment, he was determined to honor his father's life and sacrifice with every step in every small action. And Antonio, now at peace, knew he had fulfilled his mission, not only raising a doctor, but teaching his son the true value of gratitude and love. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.